Welcome to the Perinatal Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Christine, your host and certified perinatal mental health professional. This podcast is all about authentic conversations. We want to open up the discussions around perinatal health and well-being, from mood and anxiety disorders to breastfeeding to grief and loss in the perinatal period, and everything in between. While this is not therapy or medical advice, it is the place where we are going to continue to open up the discussion around all things perinatal mental, physical, emotional, and sexual health to help reduce stigma and break down these barriers to support. Hello, and welcome to Perinatal Wellbeing episode number 21, our first episode of season 2. Today, we're going to talk about the impacts of racism on reproductive health with Rochelle Maurice. Rochelle is a clinical and organizational ethicist based in Toronto, Ontario. Her work in ethics was strongly influenced by her professional background in social work, the most significant of which was in the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit and Paediatrics department in a community hospital in Toronto. As a result of her experiences in both social work and ethics, Rochelle has an interest in and passion for addressing issues that affect pregnant, birthing, and postpartum people at the intersection of health and social care. She is currently pursuing doctoral studies in social work that focuses on Black women's experiences and maternal-child care. Hi, Rochelle. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Christine. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited for us to talk today because we are going to talk about an important topic, and also we're acknowledging that it's a very big topic that encompasses so many different facets and layers that we will not be able to get to in one episode. But we really want to talk about the impact of racism on reproductive health.
Yeah, it's a massive topic, and there's so much to get into there. And I'm sort of diving into this stuff. It, relates to my interests. It relates to work that I've done in the past, and I'm just learning so much more about the different facets of it that it's now like all that I can see.
Right. Yeah. Once you see it, you can't really ignore it. Right. We have to keep seeing, we have to keep talking. And that's why we're doing this episode today.
Awesome.
Yeah. So you are currently doing your PhD in social work, and you're doing some,
I am.
Yeah. And doing some important work in research in terms of infant feeding recommendations for infants of Black mothers who consume cannabis. Is that right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Just getting into, so not yet in the thick of it just yet, but in the preliminary stages of thinking about all of the factors that go into that kind of context.
Right. Which is, again, we could have a separate podcast episode about that topic specifically. And so how is that, brought you to really also exploring reproductive justice and the impact of racism on reproductive health?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm so fortunate to have an amazing supervisor through school who, when I talked to her initially about sort of my interest and my question that I really wanted to explore, one of the first comments that she made was, the pinkification of pot does not include Black women, and there's something there.
Wow.
And there's sort of some articles that have been written about this, exploring this, people speaking anecdotally about their experiences. And there's like collections and collections of these stories. But coming to understand the reasons why, and therefore looking for change. How do we make things more equitable? How do we make the changes so that it does include Black women or women of color? Is really sort of this important starting point. And, naturally the wrapping up of not necessarily only race, but motherhood, race and motherhood, substance use, for the purposes of this conversation, we'll bracket out, but it's so intricately connected to everything. It's just very much wrapped up in there. But like exploring and sort of trying to unravel a little bit more the like race and motherhood and what happens to not just Black women, but women of color within a North American context. A lot of the research that's done on this, or a lot of the theories that comes out of the US about these kinds of things. So that's where I'm sort of drawing from. And it brings us to really explore and examine, one huge aspect, which is reproductive justice. There's another element of that, and I'm still sort of in my processing of all of this, trying to situate obstetrical racism, which is, incidents that happen sort of in the perinatal period. Whether it's things like, and I'm not going to get all of the aspects right, and there's a great scholar that writes on this, that talks about, like misdiagnosis, misleading diagnoses, or lapse in diagnoses. The Black women not being, or women of color not being believed when they say that there's something wrong. There are things around, pain thresholds and things like that. So things that are born out of the history of racism that were meant to be believed in order to sustain sort of abuses against women of color that come up, and they're still very much embedded and latent. And because of the codification of like scientific knowledge or scientific fact, it remains very much in medical education and healthcare. So it's those kinds of things that, and one really important factor, and I can't forget this, is around obstetrical racism, is not necessarily taking a woman of color symptoms seriously because they don't necessarily align with other diagnoses that come along with that culture.
Right.
And so an example that was given in one of the papers was a woman who was over 40, a Black woman over 40, who was pregnant with twins, and trying to say that and impress upon her obstetrician, this is a high-risk pregnancy. And the obstetrician said, you don't have diabetes and you don't have hypertension. Like, those are typically Black conditions, so you're not high risk, and not really giving consideration to all of the other factors, sort of later maternal age and sort of multiparity, right? And sort of discrediting or sort of denying or not taking into consideration the other ways in which she would be high risk, despite the fact that she doesn't have what that OB called like typical Black conditions.
Right. All of those things you mentioned have such big impacts on birthing people in the perinatal period, whether it's trying to conceive during pregnancy, labor and delivery, of course, postpartum, if things are not feeling good postpartum, whether it's physically, mentally, not being heard, not being taken seriously, not being believed, such big impacts. And I'm curious, because you said in the research, a lot of the research, coming out of the US, I know this is an issue here in Canada, but in your, research and what you've been reading and looking at the material, has there been much from Canada?
And the more I read, the more I start to wonder. And, in all fairness, a lot of the focus of my readings have been US based. I think part of the trouble is multifold. One is we really don't collect race-based data in Canada.
Yep.
And so it's very hard to kind of pinpoint or identify where there are sort of disparities. Like, we can use, I think some studies have used, other markers like preterm deliveries as a sign of disparities in perinatal care or perinatal morbidity and mortality.
Yeah.
but sort of all of the other soft factors that go into it. And I don't mean to call them soft, because the more I read, the more I come to understand that there's substance to it. There's, they're concrete in their own respective ways, and they actually should be given more credence when we look at it within a healthcare context. There was one person that I happened to stumble across on social media, and forgive me, I do not recall their name, but they did some work in looking at health disparities, perinatal health disparities, according to race within a Canadian context. And I have it on my list of things to read to better understand the context.
Right.
But unfortunately, a lot of the theories that I'm reading about come out of the US. And so we kind of transplant these notions and sort of see how we can, and frameworks, and see how we can come to understand the Canadian context. But the lack of race-based data really is a barrier to understanding that in a more comprehensive way at this point.
Right. And when we exclude people, entire races, I'll speak in a binary way, but like entire genders, even, entire groups of people from research, then we, quote unquote, don't have to address the disparities that we don't see, right? We can continue, I say we, but I mean the system can continue to treat people the way they've been treating, to ignore them, to, endanger them, kill them, right? If we don't even open our eyes to the issues.
Yeah,
That's how
absolutely. And so the other factor that I think about is knowing what information you need, right? What counts as information, what counts as knowledge, experiential knowledge. There's great hierarchies in research in terms of what counts as knowledge, what counts as data, what is rigorous, what is not. And sort of these lived experiences and those experiential kinds of things, it's they don't necessarily, they're not necessarily given the kind of validity, legitimacy, credibility that they deserve.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, to your point, when you start to take a look at, well, we're not only excluding groups of people, but when we try to do it or incorporate it in a particular way, but you kind of say, oh, those are the outliers,
Right.
or you don't, and so that, like, we can put that over there because that doesn't really count for much. Or you sort of explain it away in a discussion section of a paper to say, don't really know what to do with this because it doesn't sort of align with or map on with the frameworks that we're using or our systems of thinking. You really have to start to interrogate, well, what is the basis of the system of thinking that you're using? What is it premised on? And what does that tell us about how we take in information and how we give out information? Who counts as knowers, and really what's knowledge?
Right. In Sonia Renee Taylor's book, The Body's Not an Apology, she talks about that, of like how the typical body is really based on, a white male body, cisgendered, straight, all of those things. And really then anything outside of that is outside of the norm, and please read Sonia Renee Taylor's book. I'm not doing it justice. But she talks about it in such an incredible way that really helps you to understand it, right? Of how this really does impact all of us on a day-to-day. Like you said, if, the data and the research is based on that typical body, anything outside of that is a quote unquote outlier, right? And then therefore not valid, not included in the data. It skews the data, quote unquote, which again has big impacts on us to be able to understand the disparities or the issues that are going on.
Yeah. So I heard her talk on a podcast years ago about her book. And I was just blown away by the things that she was bringing to the forefront and bringing to mainstream discussion. And it's interesting that, I don't know if you had the experience, but I certainly did. And hearing her speak, I haven't read the book, but I was like, oh my God, yes, yes, these are the things that I think about, I feel, and, it's not something that I speak freely with friends about. Maybe you have that one confidant and you say, have you experienced this? And it's just like sharing in a vulnerability where the feeling is far more universal than, is it just me, or why am I struggling in this way? And you're absolutely right. There have been studies recently, sort of in the medical realm, where they have found that, so pulse oximeters, so the things that they use in hospitals to measure your oxygenation level, is impacted by melanin. So all the things, so like as a diagnostic tool, it then tells you, or it gives indications about how you ought to treat or not treat something. And so, and it's based on like ranges and levels and criteria as a part of a system of other things. But it's a major diagnostic tool for many aspects of care. And so because it is affected by melanin, then you start to wonder about people of color and what things have they sort of not been treated for, what things have they been over treated for or inappropriately treated for, how does their information come to bear in all of this? And that goes back to your point around, if your body of information only comes from a particular subset or group, then you're not really getting all that you necessarily need. And it informs our world in a particular way that excludes a large number of people.
Absolutely. And that is, again, if you think about that, like anytime I've interacted with healthcare, let's say even gone to the emergency room for even a sprained ankle, they put on the pulse oximeter, for everything, right? So this is not something small. And of course, giving birth to my kids, that thing was on there all the time. So that's a big deal. That has big impacts. This is why I like having these discussions, because I'm hopeful that people outside of this world, like people that are doing the work in this sphere, like in the perinatal world, for example, that they can hear this, that this is a big deal. It has big impacts.
Yeah, for sure. And so I know we talked a little bit about obstetrical racism.
Yes.
And the other thing that I really wanted to bring up was reproductive justice.
Yes.
And just to say a very, very little on this. So reproductive justice is sort of this looking at aspects of reproduction, going beyond reproductive health and reproductive rights, and taking sort of this intersectional lens and focus to think about how systemic inequality comes to bear on how people get to make decisions about childbearing and parenting, and all of those things, right? So it's sort of takes a look at all of the things. So, for example, somebody may say, I would like to have a child, or I would like to not have a child. And the reality of my situation is that in the case of I would like to not have a child, or I would not like to bring this pregnancy to term because I can't afford it. I can't afford, I know my financial situation. I cannot afford to sort of contribute and to make sure that this child and I and my family have all of the things that we need in order to do this well. Or somebody may say, I am concerned, or I am concerned that my environment
Mm-hmm.
is such that it impacts my ability to parent in the way that I want to, right? So there are maybe environmental chemicals or pollutants that that are, you know, are well embedded into the way that we live, the foods that we
Mm-hmm.
consume that come out through the breast milk and then is transferred over to the child.
Right.
And really has a huge, so it's the environmental factors that, you know, navigate, you know, what kinds of decisions you make about how you parent, how you feed your child, what kinds of things you're able to get to do, all of these other things.
Right.
Access to healthcare, access to assisted reproductive technology. And an important factor when it comes to especially women of color is getting away from sterilization abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And so like that comes to bear from the major tenets of reproductive justice, the right to have a child.
Right.
And being able to access the ability to have a child, or just the mere ability to have a child, and to be able to choose to do that freely.
Right. And so for people who might be listening that don't work in this field, can you explain for people, like give us some of those definitions in terms of, for example, sterilization, like what does that mean for people?
Yes. Okay. That's a really great question. And thanks for directing me to that. So sterilization would be, and I'm talking about them in the context of like short-term sterilization versus long-term sterilization versus permanent sterilization.
Right.
Right. And so, you know, when I think about like short and long term, it would be things like, let's say, and this has happened in the US through legislation, somebody who is a recipient of social assistance has a certain number of children, and as a part of the legislation, the government will say, you know, if you have any more children, we will cut you off of your, like, any extra funding that you will be eligible for from us. So you are required to take birth control.
Wow.
And so that is a limit. That is a limit on their ability to have children if they of their choosing.
Right.
And so that, like, birth control in certain contexts would be like sort of how I'm thinking about it. And I may be very wrong, so please forgive me on this. Certain types of birth control will be sort of like a short-term sterilization, right? And when we think about like IUDs or the pill,
Mm-hmm.
there were other longer-term birth control. And I forgot the years that this was going on in, but like a good number of years. I think it was perhaps in and around the 80s and perhaps even into the 90s, Norplant, which was sort of injected into the skin, and there were longer term sort of birth control options that was like thrust upon and insisted upon certain communities have it as a way to control sort of welfare or public assistance support from the government.
Right.
Yeah, and then there were sort of, when I think about the permanent sterilization, we mean like complete hysterectomies. And so sometimes those were coerced. People were forced after they had children to sign off on a hysterectomy in the moments after giving birth.
Yeah.
Sometimes people would enter into have an abortion, and they would say, we're having a full hysterectomy.
Right.
And they would be sort of forced. Sometimes people were signed off under false pretenses, understanding that it was going to be a short-term birth control, or perhaps a longer-term birth control. And there were generations of women of color that this has happened to, and not just Black women, but Indigenous women as well. And I believe in Canada that this, especially for Indigenous women, this has happened and like has continued to happen sort of well into the recent past. And it's these kinds of atrocities. When we talk about sterilization, we're talking about it on multiple levels.
Right. Absolutely. And thank you so much for breaking that down, because I think it's really, again, important to understand that this is not like stuff that you read in some sci-fi book that is, I don't know, a TV show or something. This is real. This is real life. This happens. It's happened recently. It's still happening, in various different ways and forms. And also, it's not just in the States, right? It's here in Canada too. And for people who have never been subjected to anything like that, or for people who might not have even thought that this could be a possibility because of their privilege, this is real. It's like really understanding, like you said, if you want to say, okay, we're going to start a family. I don't know. Maybe you're in a couple and you're like, okay, we're going to start a family. Yay. And then you like start trying and do your thing. Like, good for you. But there's a lot of people who like, that's not an option because it's been forced or taken away from them or regulated, or, the number of children they want to try to have is regulated. This is real and terrible. That's a silly word.
It's not. It's not a silly word, but there's like what is a good word to describe that? It's heavy.
It's heavy.
It's heavy, and heavy is not even the best word to describe it.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's complicated. The systems are incredibly complex.
Yeah.
I think, when we think about sort of mainstream motherhood, or at least when I think about it, and not that, the disclaimer is that I'm not a mom myself.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with new, not just moms, new parents,
mm-hmm.
Including those that don't identify with like the female gender.
Yeah.
And there's so much wrapped up in motherhood, parenthood, mothering, parenting,
Yeah.
that makes it so intricate and complex that even when we think about the childbearing stage and the limits to, what to eat, what you can engage in, what becomes high risk, and for you that otherwise would not even factor into a consideration of risk at all. And then think about all of this stuff in the context of people who can or can't afford, for whom access is a huge issue. Right. A little background and context: I did my social work degree in New York, and I had the great benefit of living in residence in my first year. Wow. And had to find my own place in my second year. And I lived in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, okay. Which at the time, it was really just on the cusp of gentrification. Mm-hmm. So it was a very interesting social context to sort of live in and do and think about social work. But even for myself at the time, anytime I wanted fast food, I had a variety of options in less than a block from me. Mm-hmm. But I had to buy all of my produce from the city, from Manhattan, and bring it home with me, because there was nothing green and fresh at the closest grocery store or closest grocery stores to me.
Wow.
Yeah.
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 And that has big impacts on individuals, families, children. Like you said, when you're trying to conceive, or you're pregnant, or you've, welcomed a baby, raising a little one, and you're thinking about these things potentially, right? Like, that has big impacts when you can't access food. You can access fresh food. You can't access produce easily, right? And if you can't afford to go into Manhattan, or, Manhattan is not on your route, right? Then what are you supposed to do, right?
You're absolutely right. And then the scrutiny that comes along, or the surveillance that comes along with a pregnant belly, that you could just be doing your own thing. And, because of the lack of access, the limited choices, the financial constraints, sort of the environmental, like the food deserts or healthcare access deserts, and people are scrutinizing and holding you to a particular standard of what an ideal mother looks like, and not coming to sort of frame that in the context of all of these other moving parts that go along into childbearing, childbirth, child rearing, being the kind of parent that you want to be. And so reproductive justice really calls attention to those things, right? So it's not necessarily only in three main tenets, but not only the right to have a child, or the right to not have a child, but also the right to parent and to have a family of your choosing and of your making, in a safe and healthy environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really like the key one that I think people often don't think about, and they think, how does that last bit relate to sort of, reproductive justice? But it really becomes this larger issue that when you look at the context of parenting and what does it mean to be a parent, and to raise children, what are the supports that you need, sort of materially and socially and informally, to be able to do that well.
Yes. And that's the thing. There's this ideal of motherhood, and yet there aren't the supports in place for anybody to reach that ideal. Right. And also, I mean, the ideal is unrealistic. So there's that. The ideal is also based on, cisgendered white women living in a patriarchal society, right? Where it's really our job to please men and to, look good and, be the ideal mother whilst having long flowing, beautiful hair and, bouncing back, etc. I could go on forever about that. So again, that ideal, if you don't fit into the ideal, yeah, like you're so open to criticism, to scrutiny. And how does that play out in terms of, I'm taking a little sideways turn here, but in terms of children's aid societies?
Oh gosh.
If it's too big of a question, we don't have to go there.
No, that's a really good question. I'm not going to do it justice. I'm going to do sort of this like on the surface, Reader's Digest version of it. So I think over the years, the Children's Aid Society has been trying to focus more on sort of solutions or interventions that are not as, what's the word I'm looking for? Not as invasive. That's the word I'm looking for. Not as invasive. And what's the real struggle here is that the Children's Aid Society, the work, like the whole premise, the work that they're premised on, really comes from, and you have to really do a sort of this historical tracing of like, when did all of this start? How did all of this start? Where did all of this start? What was the purpose? And it was really around white supremacy.
Yeah.
And it was really embedded in all of the things, Christine, that you just described about ideal motherhood. Mm-hmm. And using that as the standard, and then saying, anybody that doesn't fit that really is going to cause problems as we build this nation. And what we really want to do is really develop good neoliberal subjects, people that will contribute to the economy and the well-being of the state, the economic and political well-being of the state, right?
Yes.
And it's a lot of those things, and going back, actually relating it back a little bit when I was talking about obstetrical racism and sort of the things around, sort of these like sort of races, like premised in racism, things that used to justify, actions like racist acts that are still sort of latent and embedded in the work that's done. It's the same thing, or very similar here, that the whole structure around how do we what are the standards, how do we intervene, and understanding that the ability to create a framework or to create standards and then to act on those standards and then to follow through on what the resolution is comes from somewhere. It comes from a particular way of thinking and a way of knowing the world and understanding. And it's really like the importance here is to start to interrogate a lot of that. I don't have to say very much about the 60s scoop to understand
Absolutely
this, right? Like that is a really sort of good mainstream example. There are tons.
Absolutely.
And arguably there are many ways in which, despite the steps towards less invasive interventions, it's not reformed. It's not 100%. Data reveals that there's still, and I think we don't really need data to do this. That's a very particular way of knowing, but for people for whom numbers count, the numbers show that there are disproportionate number of children of color that are in care, and not just temporary care agreements, but and foster care, but are awarded crowns of the state and are permanently removed from their homes very quickly. Yeah. And I think it's important to think about sort of like the premise and the background of all of this. My hope is that, and I am aware that the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, they are working very hard to relook at the system and reform. And arguably, when you think about the whole structure of the system altogether, how does that even work? How do you begin to repair that? That's challenging.
Yes, and that's the question. I mean, obviously, we're not going to solve that. We're not going to answer that here. But
heavens no.
I agree. Yes, there are absolutely people that are working to try to make change. Again, though, if the entire structure was built on racism, and the system was to serve, that agenda, what real change can we make? How do we really change that system without basically knocking it down completely and starting from scratch? I don't know.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's so many times, in thinking about this, and a lot of the work that I do and I have engaged in the past, it's like, okay, so how do we fix this? How do we, how do we repair what we have? How do we make incremental changes so that, recognizing that it's a long game and we need to get to a certain point after a certain period of time, what are the changes that need to be made along the way? What are the tasks that need to be done? How do we get there? And then there are times when you're just shut the whole thing down and rebuild it.
Right.
But there's, and I don't mean to sound pessimistic on this. There's always that institutional memory. There's always that muscle memory that will always be there. And I think it's become such a pervasive part of not just the institution itself, but society. I mean, we have people at baseline that judge and that gauge, and I don't think you're doing this right. I think that's harmful and abusive. So it's embedded within our social way of being, our culture. And I say culture and not meaning necessarily something like indigenous culture or sort of those like culture from an international perspective, but I'm talking about like a North American culture,
Right.
because we've had centuries of this.
And so I'm thinking of that generational trauma at the hands of these systems that we see on it, especially as social workers, especially in this field. We see that show up in the here and now and how that impacts families. How does that impact reproductive health and how people are accessing, if they can, care? I don't assume, but from what I see is like that generational trauma impacting people's, feeling of, should I access this care? Should I talk to my doctor about this? Should I tell my counselor about this concern I'm having about my child? Can you speak more to that, of kind of how that comes into play with reproductive justice and health?
That is a fantastic question, an absolutely fantastic question. And you're right from the perspective of it comes to bear where people are saying, where do I feel safe?
Yeah.
And the feeling of trust, the element of mistrust or distrust. And because the systems are so interconnected, like health and social care, that you can't guarantee that your healthcare provider is a safe space for you because of the relationships to social care. And when I say social care, I mean systems like, elements of public health that are not necessarily medical related, but also like we think of the Healthy Babies, Healthy Children program, and like the peer support networks and things like that, but also in terms of Children's Aid Society. I think what happens is that I think one thing that we need to acknowledge up front is that, make no mistake, people are not making these decisions because they are bad, because they're manipulative, because they are like all of the things that people that people will say, erroneously about parents whose backs are against the wall.
Yes.
Right. And so when somebody has had terrible interactions with systems, or when somebody, because of the generational trauma, is aware of the risk, the risk to them because of where they come from, the color of their skin, like all of these things, their history, their culture, all the rest of that is different from a white Anglo-Saxon society. It's always in a level of awareness in the back of your head that I am being watched and I will be punished more harshly. But you're right. There's a development of this secrecy, and it comes from a place of protection and self-preservation.
Yes.
It also makes me think a bit about, and not necessarily, maybe indirectly, in the context of what people will do when, to preserve their sense of identity. And what steps people will take to ensure that they get to be and live the person that they want to be and live. And they see that as central to them, as they should, essential to their very existence, their being, as they should, but everything else becomes the enemy and everything else becomes entrusted. or mistrusted. But then when the scrutiny falls to them, they are judged incorrectly for why they made the decisions.
Right.
Because there are things like, and I remember thinking this, like, just be upfront and honest with Children's Aid Society, like hiding things from them is not going to help you without a full comprehension of the decision somebody makes to be, to not fully disclose things. And it's a feeling of a sense of emotional safety, psychic safety, mental safety, physical safety, and not only for oneself, but for one's children.
Right.
And that then impacts who you engage with, but and what kinds of supports you seek out, how you choose to seek out those supports. And on top of that, imagine going through moments in your life where community counts and matters, and you are completely alone, you're completely isolated because the systems around you just don't understand the way you function and operate in the world.
Right. Right. So we have the systemic institutionalized racism. We have the generational trauma coming from the racism. And then we have the current, way that people are not included, like we talked about, in research, which therefore their bodies are not included in the care, the medicine, the procedures, things that, can help them in whatever situation they're in, right? That sounds so alienating. Like, how do you seek help? And how, even if you do put yourself out there and seek help and ask for help, you don't know for sure. You don't know that you're going to get the appropriate care.
Yeah. I think people become very resourceful. I think people turn to informal communities. And when I say informal communities, I mean it. And there's a part of my brain that's like, no, that's a proper community. Like, why would you call it informal? And when I say informal communities, I mean to necessarily take it out of the structure of like a community center, or like a parents group, a hospital, those kinds of things, or like, like formalized programming. I think what people do is that they find people within their community, and whatever, like a community of parents, an ethnocultural community, a generational community, those kinds of things. I think people find community, whatever that means to them, and they assess whether it's a safe space. They find a community of like-minded people, and then they seek help from there. And sometimes, hopefully there are cases where people feel connected in those ways, that that they feel that they could reach out for help. And the resources from there, in terms of the preserving the safety, could be varied. It could be somebody that says, do you know what, this is a healthcare provider that totally gets it. I've had a good experience. So-and-so had a good experience. This, my mom had a good experience. That person's mom had a good experience. That person's parent had a good experience. And I think you should go here. Like, there's a long legacy of safety that's there. And sometimes there are things that are less than great. But in an evaluation of risk, it is like, this risk is acceptable and palatable to me, and I am going to go here, because the risk of going to somebody who's professional is too high for what it means to me in terms of my safety and my child's safety, and all the ways that we think about safety.
Right.
And those are like, and I know those are sort of binary ways of thinking about it. I'm sure there's more options, but those are people that are connected. And are connected and feel connected.
Right.
Because you can have a case where there are people that, you and I may look at them and say, but you've got people, why don't you rely on those people? And they'll say, I don't feel safe.
Right. Yeah.
So they don't feel connected. And then there's the people that like really don't have anybody.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right.
If we look at rural communities, of course, if we look at newcomers to Canada, and especially if they live in rural communities, even less chance of community and connecting with people in their own community, right? That has big impacts as well,
Yeah.
right? When you talk about access, right? That's why access matters, right? Okay, great. If you live in Toronto or Vancouver, like you live in a big city, good for you. That's great. But then what about the other people that do not live in those big cities, right?
I was listening to CBC this morning super early, and there was somebody talking about the issue of access and naming the same things that you named, like, cities tend to be quite resource rich.
Yeah.
But we know, especially in Ontario, the land of Ontario, we're not populated with cities in that way. And there's, lots of people living in Ontario that live outside of cities, and access becomes a huge, huge issue.
Absolutely.
And not just for healthcare and I'm including sort of like people with emotion, like requiring emotional supports, whether formally or informally, mental health supports, well-being, and all of these sort of more formal and less formal things that they need in order to not just survive, but thrive.
Right.
When I think about it. Yeah.
We covered a lot in today's discussion, including obstetrical racism, reproductive justice, generational trauma, and much more. This discussion was so in-depth that we will continue the discussion in the next episode. Next episode, we will talk about the importance of applying an intersectional lens when thinking about care of people in the perinatal period, including the intersections of racism, disabilities, and accessing care. You can find Rochelle on Instagram @_Rochelle Maurice_. Please leave me a comment and let me know what your takeaway from today's discussion is. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please share this podcast with any of your friends or family members who may benefit from it. If you feel you are experiencing any of the symptoms or issues that we discussed today, please reach out to any one of your supports or go to perinatalwellbeing.ca for more information, blog posts, podcast episodes, and ways to connect with us. Check out our new episode every other Monday.